Well, let me say how delighted I am to be here, and first to thank Professor Leiner for the generous invitation to be with you, and Carolina, wherever she is, busy doing something for the program, but Carolina Rehrmann for the logistical support. It's always a great pleasure for me to interact with young scholars and also with colleagues from the field of reconciliation studies. So the fact that we are bringing together different generations, different disciplines, different national perspectives, I think is wonderful and very productive. This is kind of the dead spot in the day, so I hope that I can keep you awake, and I hope my jet lag allows me to stay awake. There is a problem with time apparently, so if I'm flagging, then that will help us with time because I can just stop. But I will try to get through the whole thing. I am a political scientist and someone trained in international relations, but my work has always been interdisciplinary. That may come from my combination of a British and an American education. So my topic is the EU, Germany, and the Balkans. This is not to suggest that other European actors like NATO or the OSCE are not important. They are. But I would still argue that the EU is central in dealing with reconciliation issues in the Balkans, as is Germany. First, let me define reconciliation. It's a term we use a lot. People have different meanings for it. You should know mine. And by reconciliation, I mean the process, and I emphasize the process, of building long-term peace between former enemies through bilateral institutions across governments and societies. It's always at least a two-level process, governments and societies. And for me, reconciliation as a deep term, as a full term, a robust term, involves the development of friendship, trust, empathy, and magnanimity. So that's my overall definition. First, I'd like to make two main introductory remarks and then address 5 topics related to Europe and the Balkans. I'll just list the 5 topics here. First of all, the nature of conflict or the nature of conflicts. Secondly, the EU and German motivations for being engaged in this region of the Balkans. The third topic is EU policy and mechanisms. Then Germany's role. And finally, I think we need to come to some assessment of where we stand today and where we might go in the future. So an effort to look at success, but also failure, and prospects regarding reconciliation going forward. Those are the 5 topics. But first, the introductory remarks. The first introductory remark is a series of quotations that I think really frame the landscape of the overall topic that I have today. It's an attempt, using these quotations as an attempt to fix the issues. Europe and the Balkans, both separately and together, are like a kaleidoscope. And I come to your octopus. I think it's a similar notion. They're like a kaleidoscope. They represent different shapes and sizes, different colors, different patterns, as well as the hope, maybe not the reality, but the hope for a bright future. Whenever you turn a kaleidoscope, you hope to see something beautiful and pretty and shining in front of you. Doesn't always work. So as a kaleidoscope, we also have to see that the Balkans show that the elements are subject to sudden change and sudden movement. You have it fixed, you can change it completely, just immediately, by a slight movement. And that slight movement can disrupt some semblance of balance and can force the various parts to rethink goals and priorities. So what I'm saying, I guess, in the end, is that we're talking about an ever-changing context, an ever-changing reality, and that's difficult. It's extremely difficult to deal with. So I think the notion of a kaleidoscope has the benefits, the beauty, but also the downside of change when change is negative. So let me look at these three statements that really, as I say, try to fix, in this notion of a kaleidoscope, fix the Balkans and the EU and the Balkans. The first statement is from August 2014, so just over a year ago, from the Conference on the Western Balkans, that brought together a variety of EU members and Balkans EU aspirants. And this was one of the statements at the end of the conference. We agree that today's conference should provide a framework for a period of 4 years, during which we will further our endeavours to make additional real progress in the reform process, in resolving outstanding bilateral and internal issues, and in achieving reconciliation within and between societies in the region. We are also united in the aim of enhancing regional economic cooperation and laying the foundations for sustainable growth. Now, why do I use this quote? First, reconciliation as a goal within and between societies is key. As a goal, again, the reality may be somewhat different, but the goal is important. Reform as a key objective, but again, realistically, as a process, not an instantaneous reality. And thirdly, the goal of sustainable growth for individual countries, but always within the framework of regional cooperation. The second statement came from the very recent, this past August, barely less than a month ago, the August 2015 Western Balkans Summit involving EU members and Balkan countries in the long membership path. And that statement was, the Western Balkans region has come a long way since the violent breakup of former Yugoslavia, notably in the areas of political and economic stability, as well as in regional cooperation. While there has been good progress in establishing a web of regional cooperation structures over the last years, more efforts are needed to solve outstanding bilateral disputes. Furthermore, concrete steps from political leaders in the Western Balkans towards lasting reconciliation in the region are necessary. Reconciliation is essential to promote stability and support the creation of an environment in Southeast Europe conducive to overcoming the legacy of the past. And here I would note the centrality of reconciliation as a strategy, the challenge of bilateral disputes, the legacy of the past of conflict and hatred, and I would note there the term that was used, overcoming. I think it's an unfortunate term. I think we have to constantly struggle with the past, confront the past. So if that's the mindset that you can actually overcome the past, then that's somewhat problematic. Some sense of achievement in general regarding the main goal of stability. And then the essential requirement of political leadership to make progress in any area. Then the third statement comes from a joint article by the German and Austrian foreign ministers on the occasion of the summit that I just mentioned. And here the quote is, the prospect of EU membership has so far been the single most important incentive for the implementation of tough but necessary reforms and for sustained efforts towards reconciliation. Without the Western Balkans, the European Union is clearly incomplete. So there again, reconciliation is a primary purpose. EU membership is a main incentive for Balkans countries as they chart their political and economic futures. A difficult road. Nobody's saying it's easy. And finally, the vision of a larger Europe, the notion of a common destiny. The second introductory remark I want to make, in addition to these three quotes that I've just given, that I think really frame a lot of what I'm saying, this second introductory remark addresses the current relevance of the topic. Now, I think this topic would be relevant in any case. It's been an issue that's been around for over 25 years. what are we, 90, more than 25 years, right? But it's an issue that has always been a relevant issue since the conflict, because of the nature of the conflict, the endurance of the conflict, the efforts to deal with the conflict. But I think it's particularly relevant today. I think there's some added relevance today. I'd like to make 8 points. First, the current relevance of the region as the root, as you all know, and I think the whole world knows now because it's so much on the political and media agenda, the current relevance of the region as the route between the Balkans. The route between the Balkans and the EU is the main passageway, first for migration from the Middle East and Africa, from areas in conflict, to Europe, and secondly for migration from the Balkans countries themselves. And what we're seeing then, and I mean from people indigenous to the Balkans, not as a passageway through which people are coming from one place to get to another place. So there are 2 levels to the refugee crisis, and I think we have to look at both those levels differently. But we're talking about the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II. Just to give you some statistical indications, there were some 102,000 migrants between January and July 2015, before it really heated up already, coming along this passageway, compared to 8,000 in the same months the previous year. So from 8,000 in 2014 to 102,000 in 2015, just January to July. And the situation obviously is escalating. In a 3-day period in mid-September, more than 17,000 migrants entered Croatia. 3-day period. 83,000 have transited Macedonia in the last 3 months. And just looking at the indigenous population movement too, because that's important, 34,000 Kosovars from Serbia, Albania and Kosovo sought asylum in Germany in the last months. Now their hopes are very, very slim, because Germany has made a clear distinction between people coming from war zones and people who are coming from, and the Balkans are now considered safe countries, being deemed that. Of the 44,000 what are called irregular migrants crossing from the Western Balkans to the EU in the first quarter of 2015, 27,000, so a half, were nationals of the region, were from the Balkans themselves. Again, I want to point out this 2-level or 2-dimensional refugee crisis, and to point out the complexity of the migration challenge. There's not, both in numbers and in origins, there's not one easy solution. And in fact, I think it's not a European solution, it's a global solution. And if we don't see it as a global solution, we're not going to be able to really answer the problem at all. Now it's a mass movement of humanity, I think represents a fundamental challenge to the stability, identity and purpose of the EU as a peace community founded on reconciliation, characterized by solidarity, tolerance and diversity. And it's also a challenge to the EU in terms of its own self-perception and practice as a reconciliation actor. It's also a challenge to the delicate, incipient process of reconciliation based again on those 3 principles in the Balkans themselves. So again, you've got a 2-level challenge. None of this is just a one set of problems. It's always multiple. And there is the real potential, and this is where it gets, I think, very complicated, the real potential people have been identifying for a major anti-Muslim backlash, not only in countries like Hungary, where it's a stated animosity against refugees and against Muslim populations, but in the Balkans countries themselves, because of the history in those countries. And some people fear a repeat of some of the anti-Muslim horrors of the 1990s. So it's a lot of things coming together. It's very hard to untangle. Now, another point I would like to make about the relevance, the Balkans region displays a variety of conflicts, which makes it very interesting, but again, even more complex and difficult. There are border disputes, there are political disputes, there are minority rights issues, there are issues related to the dissolution of Yugoslavia. And those categories, those four categories I mentioned, came from the European Fund for the Balkans, which wrote a position paper for this Western Balkans summit on disputes, and those were the four categories they used. The region is also a laboratory for understanding the potential and the reality of different forms of reconciliation. So certainly different forms of conflict, but different forms of reconciliation. And here I would mention we have both internal and international reconciliation. We have practical, pragmatic, as well as psychological, emotional reconciliation. Again, either reality or potential. We have a range, we can see a range and intensity and different types involving what I would say are the four ways that we can use the term reconciliation relating to range, intensity, and type. That is, the first is peaceful coexistence. Reconciliation is peaceful coexistence. Secondly, reconciliation is normalization of relations. Thirdly, reconciliation is rapprochement. And finally, reconciliation as genuine amity and friendship. And they really differ, I would say, in terms of purpose and in terms of intensity of the relationships, and how far one has moved from the situation of conflict. The Balkans is also a window, again, why it's so relevant and so useful, is a window on different kinds of actors. And we know that there are many actors in reconciliation. It's not just one set of actors in transformation from conflict to reconciliation. We have bilateral actors, individual EU members, individual Balkans countries. So we have bilateral and multilateral. The EU as a whole, as an entity as a whole, the Balkans Regional Cooperation Council, which is a multilateral organization. Then we have governmental and non-governmental actors, non-governmental civil society. Then we have distinction between EU member states and EU aspirants, those hoping to become members. We also have positive and negative EU member states. Germany as positive, both in terms of reconciliation and in terms of enlargement. Negative, Greece, Slovenia, Croatia in trying to keep certain Balkans countries out. So we have a whole range of relationships and power dynamics going on between the actors, which can be useful because you always have another tool that maybe you can use, but also can be very difficult. The Balkans, looking at the Balkans in the sense of transformation from conflict to reconciliation, also highlights a very important aspect of reconciliation, the role of third parties in transformation. And here I would refer to both the EU and Germany as model and mediator. There's a question mark, but as model and mediator. Or also looking at Germany and the EU as normative, material, and shaping powers, how they exercise their powers and the way they try to organize this region. And they play various roles, but this is all the role of third parties. If we look at policies, EU, Germany, their policies, they entail a wide range of mechanisms, which also makes the Balkans, again, a laboratory if we're thinking about reconciliation more broadly. But that, of course, raises the challenge of comprehensiveness and of coordination. The more mechanisms you have, the more chance you have also for competing mechanisms, both in terms of financial competition, but also a competition for attention. And finally, or the two more points, the EU and Germany are propelled by various motivations and goals, again emphasizing the issue of competing objectives. There's a lot of complexity. And if you diagram this, you couldn't fill the page. You'd have to have several pages to just note all of these things. And finally, I think the case of the EU, Germany, and the Balkans reveals features of both success and failure. And in reconciliation studies today, one of the chief things that we need to do is to look at both success and failure. Both teach us something. So let me try to look at this complex relationship between the EU and Germany on the Balkans in some detail, and start with the nature of conflict. Conflict's old and new, and the importance of the past and the future. And I'd like to start with this notion of the fragility of transformation from conflict to peace. And just refer to the statement the Serbian foreign minister gave in August 2015 at this conference. He said, "I would like to warn you that the situation is not as idyllic as we might wish to present it." And of course, it's in the EU's interest to present it as idyllic, to pat itself on the back and say, look at all the great things we've done. While having great appreciation for this summit initiative, I would like to invite all of us who make up the Western Balkans not to act in accordance with the fact that once a year we talk about the future. It becomes a ritual just to talk about it once a year, and then revert to the past. So we don't learn anything. As you saw in the last months, there have been many problems in the relations between the Balkans countries. And then I'd also like to note the lack of a sense of solidarity in the region, and this was highlighted by the Macedonian foreign minister on the same occasion when he said, "We have to get out of the stereotype that has been developed in the Balkans context that membership to the EU signifies that you get a big baseball bat." It's an American analogy, that you get a big, and then in the US it's also a mafia analogy, that you get a big baseball bat that you can use against those that are meant to join the club before they join it. And that was referring particularly to Greece, which has vetoed accession negotiations with Macedonia, though candidate country status has been there since 2005. That's over this whole naming question. So, as I said, the European Fund for the Balkans suggested that refers to the persistence of unresolved bilateral disputes, some open, some only potential, pose a real risk of renewed instability by delaying EU integration and distracting from domestic reforms. And I refer to the four types. Now, on border disputes, today only Serbia and Macedonia and Kosovo and Macedonia have fully recognized their mutual borders. The troubling areas are Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Montenegro, Croatia and Slovenia. On political disputes around national identity and statehood issues, Kosovo, Serbia, Macedonia, Greece, on the naming issue. Minority rights issues, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Kosovo, Croatia. Dissolution of former Yugoslavia, things that are left over from that. Questions of assets and liabilities, like this Ljubljanska Bank in Slovenia, and people outside Slovenia not being reimbursed for their holdings. Or the results of wars, missing persons, restitution, refugees, commemoration. So we have a long list of conflicts, or potential conflicts. And before we get to EU and German policy to stave off, resolve, or manage conflicts, and it's hard to know which term to use because it's not just resolution of conflict. Sometimes the best we can do is manage conflict. Sometimes we can stave it off. It's not straightforward. And try to promote peace. I'd like to look at the motivations, because the motivations I think are very important, and we might see some missing motivations. And I'd say there are 4 principal motivations for the EU and Germany. Germany has some particular ones, but together, as they try to address conflict and peace. And these appear regularly. You can read thousands of statements, and you'll find kind of the similar. The first is stability, the second is prosperity, the third is democracy, and the fourth is reconciliation. Now, the overall purpose is to fashion a process, and again, not necessarily an end point. I think there's a recognition in people who study reconciliation and people who try to put it in practice that the process is as important as the outcome, and the outcome will take a very long time, so you better be focused on the process. So to fashion a process, so the past of the 1990s will not be repeated, the 1990s wars in the Balkans. This vision is a reconciliation that brings an acceptance of different ethnicities, an acceptance of different religions, and an active tolerance for the other within and between countries. A reconciliation that protects minority rights, that involves accountability for the past, that extends the EU model to a large swath of Europe, making it whole. Again, this is the motivation. Whether the reality is there is another question. One could label this goal a moral purpose. So it's kind of a high vision, moral purpose, to bring a stable peace, that old term in reconciliation studies, a stable peace to the region. But the EU also has very pragmatic objectives. It has a conception of stability in a broad security sense for the sake of the region, but also for the EU, so the problems of the region don't spill over to the EU and affect it negatively. And of course, the refugee question today is a prime example of this whole issue of spillover. And you see how bewildered EU members are, and you see an alternative view from the first one I gave in the way that they've reacted, and the pragmatic response is the one that often comes through instead of the moral purpose. And there's a firm belief that stability-based reconciliation must be intimately connected to the economic goal of prosperity and the political goal of democracy and human rights. And those moral and pragmatic goals, I would say, were very evident in Germany's reactions to the Balkans in the wars of the 1990s. The problem is that in times of crisis, like now, the moral purpose tends to get relegated to second place. Even in times of relative calm, different EU countries will assign different weight and different priority to the moral and pragmatic objectives. You just have a lot of room for competing goals, competing objectives. So now what does the EU actually do? I'd like to first suggest some general characteristics. EU policies and mechanisms are complex, they're holistic, they're institutional, they're structural, they're short and long-term, they cover a range of functional areas and employ the enlargement model applied to Central and Eastern Europe previously. And that in and of itself may be a problem because we're talking about two different situations. We're talking about different stages in time. So this may make them not look at the issues as they should look at them because they have this other lens that they're bringing, this other experience. And there are three frameworks, basic frameworks for how the EU approaches the Balkans. There's first the Copenhagen criteria of June 1993, which were for all enlargements, not just for enlargement to the Balkans. And I just read that to you. It's important. Membership requires that the candidate country has achieved stability of institutions guaranteeing democracy, the rule of law, human rights, respect for and protection of minorities, the existence of a functioning market economy, as well as the capacity to cope with competitive pressures and market forces within the Union. Membership presupposes the candidate's ability to take on the obligations of membership, including adherence to the aims of political, economic, and monetary union. That's one of the three frameworks that the EU brings in approaching the Balkans. My question is, and I'm sure for countries in the Balkans, are these requirements too tough? They've been there since 93, but we're in a different world today. We have a different set of circumstances. If they were to change, would that change the very notion of what the EU is? And sometimes the EU has these criteria and then doesn't apply them. So it's not an easy story. Secondly, the second framework, the Thessaloniki Agenda for the Western Balkans, June 2003, a similar, again, almost acknowledging, well, we haven't done that much in 10 years. But I would just mention one point. The sustainable return of refugees and internally displaced persons is critical for ethnic reconciliation and as an indication of democratic maturity. It remains high on our priority agenda. So I think that question of refugees and internally displaced persons and ethnic reconciliation is also important. Then the third framework, the Berlin process, started by Angela Merkel. There was the summit that I referred to as the first quote in 2014. Recognizing the slow process, so you go from 1993 to 2003 to beyond 2013 to actually 2014, recognition that there had been slow progress in the accession process, an effort to take stock, to be forward-thinking, and to suggest there would be regular conferences. There's supposed to be one in Vienna in 2015 and then in Paris in 2016. I'd just like to read what the Albanian delegation said. A region in peace and well prepared to join the European Union by guaranteeing a dignified living for all its citizens. A dignified living for all its citizens. That's how he foresaw the Balkans in this notion of a Berlin process. And then the Albanian foreign minister, the process of Berlin is a bridge between the Western Balkans and the EU. And as we know, bridges have great significance for the wars in the Balkans and since. And bridges have to go, and somebody mentioned mutuality. I think it was you. It goes both ways. And one of the dangers is that the EU can have this paternalistic notion as it looks at the Balkans, not a notion of, if not equal in terms of power, in terms of material measurements, they have to be equal in terms of respected individuals dealt with in dignity, equal in terms of common goals. But one could ask about Thessaloniki, did action follow, and how long do populations have to wait for some hope when these processes take so long? And then in some places there's not a particular interest in joining the EU any longer because it's taken so long. And then with the Berlin process, is this yet another framework for talking and not acting? So there are 5 main areas in which the EU has been active. Economic, you're probably all familiar with the stabilization and association agreements, tailored to each country, but basically similar elements: free trade, common economic and political objectives, including reform and protection of rights, pre-accession financial assistance, regional cooperation. There also is this regional cooperation that tries to give voice to countries in the region acting as a collective. And there's a particular emphasis in the economic efforts on energy and transportation connectivity. Those are two areas that you will find mentioned a lot. Political security area, you have common security and defense policy instruments that are being used by the EU. The EU has had a facilitative mediating role in the Serbia-Kosovo 2013 agreements on normalization of relations and the subsequent high-level dialogues between the two sides. It's played a stabilizing role, Bosnia-Herzegovina, through military-led missions, police mission. It's also had missions to uphold the rule of law in Kosovo and Macedonia. I put those all under political security. It's had a particular emphasis on youth, and I think this may be the most critical dimension of activities. There is now, it's going to be put into place a dual education system because there's extremely high unemployment. And again, the people that we really need to give hope to is young people. And we know from some studies done, for example, by the German political foundation, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, in Kosovo at least, there's quite concerning public opinion data about young people being disaffected, becoming more conservative. So dual education system based on the German model, where people get trained for jobs and educated more generally. It's very practical. Then the Balkans Youth Exchange Office, which is just being created, modeled very specifically on the Franco-German and German-Polish models that was agreed to at the Vienna summit. And there's the first sentence says, to promote the spirit of reconciliation and cooperation between the youth in our region by designing joint programs acknowledging the best values and cultural traditions of our peoples. And then it goes on with the aim to try to counter xenophobia and racism. But the EU, the effort will be for the EU to fund some of this, to open up educational programs like Erasmus, and the Commission is planning a summit on youth. The fourth area that I would like to mention is commemoration that the EU has been involved in. And specifically the commemoration, the 20th anniversary of the mass atrocities of Srebrenica. The EU in its statement on the occasion of the 20th anniversary used the term genocide, and this whole question of the language that we use in conflict and reconciliation studies is very important. And I'd just like to read to you, in Srebrenica, Europe is faced with its shame. Europe failed to stand up to the promise of our founding fathers and to the dreams of their grandsons. Could be mothers and granddaughters. No more war in Europe, no more murders in the name of race or the nation, no more genocides. Srebrenica is a call to action. That action is never let it happen again. Srebrenica tells us that the original intuition of our European Union is still valid, and it is the only way to bring peace in our continent, dividing the peoples of Europe among us and them, and that of course is going on in the refugee crisis, will only originate new conflicts. Christian and Muslim, Serb, Croat and Bosniak, migrant and local, aiming for ethnically pure states will not bring about peace. We need to make it possible for all communities to come together, not to tear apart. Our union is about living together. Now, the Serbian president obviously met with criticism following his election last year when he said, and I quote, "There was no genocide in Srebrenica." His predecessor did recognize the term genocide, but the current president did not. He did say on the occasion of the 20th anniversary, "I kneel and ask for forgiveness for Serbia for the crime committed in Srebrenica. I apologize for the crimes committed by any individual in the name of our state and our people." But this is not enough for victims. One Bosnian Muslim leader called on the president to recognize this as an act of genocide. He said, "We ask this truth to be recognized and words to be chosen when talking about it, and to respect the decisions of international courts," calling it genocide. And according to a BBC report, the president of the Mothers of Srebrenica Association said she was not convinced of his sincerity, Serbian president's sincerity, and she said, "We do not need someone to kneel and to ask for forgiveness. We want to hear the Serbian president and Serbia say the word genocide." So the question of naming, the question of what is the term that leads to everything else is critical. And so I think the fact that the EU used the term genocide in its statement was important. Now the question is whether I should speak about Germany or leave that out, as I don't know what somebody was going to tell me about the time.
We have still 5 minutes.
5 minutes, so maybe I can come to Germany later. I won't go into the German details, I can do that later, but let me just say that Germany has played a leadership role. It did in the Balkans Wars in the 90s, and it does today. And there are some very specific, unique German reasons for that. And I do want to come back to it, if we can, because I think it very much will affect what's going on in the future. Let's see here. Let me come then to the ultimate question of success and failure and future prospects. I'd like to look at success and failure in general and then in specifics. Now, the EU and German, that I haven't then talked about, overall strategy for securing peace in the Balkans is, and Germans always have these terms, like Wandel durch Annäherung, or Stabilität durch Verflechtung. I mean, there are always these nice German terms, or a Gesamtkonzept. But here in the Balkans, I think the EU and German overall strategy for securing peace is reconciliation through integration, if you want an overall statement. So where do we stand on that? Well, only 2 countries are now members. Slovenia in 2004 already, Croatia not until 2013, and in part because various people wanted to stand in their way. Montenegro and Serbia have started membership talks. Macedonia and Albania are candidate countries. Since the summer, the long-stalled stabilization and association agreement process has been activated now in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a good sign. And Kosovo is a potential candidate for membership. On balance, the record is mixed. What is important, it is mixed, it could be better. What is important is that there's a process. And it's important that there's a process because that process can contain conflict, even if it doesn't take us too far along the reconciliation spectrum. And that, I think, is very important. So I would refer to this as peaceful coexistence. There is that success that it's peaceful coexistence. It's failure because it's taken a long time to get there, and we really could be further along. That's how I would also describe the EU's achievements with their security-related police and military missions. They've been major. They are successes in the containment of conflict. Then if we look at specific policies, programs in a variety of countries, and first between Serbia and Kosovo. And on the positive side, the 2013 agreements on normalization, so there I would say we're in a different category, beyond peaceful coexistence to normalization, and then the specific agreements that that were agreed to on the eve of this August 2015 Vienna summit, in telecommunications, in energy, in Kosovo having an international dialing code, which adds to its international presence and recognition, the joint use of the Mitrovica-Sarajevo don't pronounce things correctly, the Mitrovica Bridge, and the fact that municipalities with Serb majorities will now have more rights and form into some kind of association, so they won't be so fractured. And then there's this ongoing process of dialogue facilitated by the EU High Representative. But on the negative side, there are news reports of slow implementation of these agreements. It's one thing to have an agreement, it's another thing to actually put it into place. And there were also news reports in September 2014 of the killing of an officer in the EU's EULEX mission in Kosovo as a statement of opposition to reconciliation. And then the third thing I would mention is minority rights. The EU has noted, as have others, discrimination against Albanians and Roma in Serbia, and this will be a key issue that is looked at as the membership negotiations for Serbia go forward. So again, it's mixed. Bosnia and Herzegovina, again, you see some plus, but also a lot of negatives. On the minority rights question, this was it's a problem because the Dayton Accords, which ended the war in 1995, was set up this very complicated tripartite arrangement privileging Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs, and it actually discriminates against Roma and Jewish minorities. And the EU concern over that was one of the reasons that the Stabilization and Association process was stalled. Even though it was signed in 2008, the EU does believe that there now has been a written commitment both to a European process and to a reform process brokered by the EU between the government and the opposition in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The EU is sufficiently concerned that in this past summer it was agreed that the Stabilization and Association process should now go into effect. But the minority issue is a big one. It's a very big one, and the EU has to really stick to that. And I think it's one of the areas where it says things but doesn't do very much, doesn't use the instruments that it could use, the conditionality that it could use to bring about greater achievements. And then commemoration in relations with Serbia, I already mentioned the differences in Mogherini's statement. She also criticized those in Bosnia and Herzegovina who forced the Serbian president to leave the Srebrenica commemoration because he was hounded out, essentially. However, we should note she cancelled her participation. She made the statement, but she didn't go. Why didn't she go? Because the last-minute issues over the Iran nuclear deal. And you can say, well, that was a very important thing. But this raises the issue of, there has to be constant attention. You can't look at it and then look at something else, and I think that's a more of a negative thing. Serbia and Croatia, the EU and Germany has emphasized dialogues about the past as a way, and this is a German person's term, Wolfgang Hopkins, writing about Franco-German relations, dialogues about the past as a way to decontaminate history. Understand the past, but that's had little effect between peoples of these two countries, between Serbia and Croatia, as evidenced very recently in the 20th anniversary commemorating Operation Storm. And you saw this cleavage between the two sides. Croatia held this big military parade to commemorate its victory over rebel Serbs and is building a museum to memorialize its victory. Serbia, however, held a day of mourning as commemoration for the 200,000 Serbs who fled Croatia because of Operation Storm, and they've called Croatian actions at the time ethnic cleansing. So on that, the efforts to get people to talk about the past, we don't see a lot going on. And also, the EU rhetorically has placed, again, a great emphasis on minority rights, but we've seen something disturbing very recently. There was supposed to be the use of the Cyrillic alphabet in Vukovar, in eastern Croatia, but that's now been disputed, and in August the city council voted to remove bilingualism, disenfranchising thereby the Serbian minority. Then Croatia, Slovenia, on the negative side, and I guess it's mainly negative, both had agreed to an EU-brokered, so it again emphasizes the EU, arbitration tribunal on the border dispute over the Gulf of Piran, but Croatia left that tribunal when it was evident that the Slovenian judge was compromised. And particularly resonant for Croatia, this issue is particularly resonant for Croatia, as Slovenia had tried to stall its pre-accession process before it actually finally became a member in 2013. This points out, of course, that membership doesn't solve all issues. This myth that if you become a member, everything works, clearly isn't the case. But membership can perhaps provide a framework for dealing with issues. Then Macedonia, on the positive side, the EU was able to broker the appointment of a special prosecutor to look into the allegations of government illegal surveillance that hobbled the political process for many months. There was no government for many months. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, Greece still continues to block Macedonia's EU path over the naming issue. So how would I conclude? First, in general, the overarching question of the future of Europe based on the goal of reconciliation. This is a general point. And here I posit alternatives. Will it be the Orban vision? Christian Europe, homogeneous Europe, versus what I would call the Merkel and Tusk perspective, solidarity, tolerance, and diversity. Now, the recent Interior Ministers' agreement, I think it was last Wednesday, and note it was a Franco-German plan, so you have the benefits of Franco-German reconciliation coming out in their being able to show some leadership in proposals. The plan is a good indication, the plan to spread out the absorption of refugees, but what was bad about it was that it was highly contested in Eastern Europe, the Eastern European members. So you did get a plan, but it was highly contested. And in the end, I think it's 120,000, which is nothing when we see how many refugees are continuing to come. So I'm not optimistic that this period will be a shining example of European commitment to the principle and practice of reconciliation in the larger sense of empathy, understanding, and amity. At best, we have peaceful coexistence and normalization, some glimmer of rapprochement, but no friendship and amity. And what are the requirements for doing better? I would say there are 4 requirements. Political leadership in the region and in the EU, with Germany playing a critical role, not only with France. I think Germany needs to resuscitate its reconciliation habits and bona fides with Poland and with the Czech Republic, because they are largely against some reasonable solution to the refugee crisis. But Germany will be a critical leader, but we need more. Secondly, it will require many more civil society dialogues. Civil society, I've left that out, unfortunately, it has been part of what the EU's been doing, but we need many more civil society dialogues, and they have to connect to the political level. What they do on their own is fine, but they also have to influence the political level, and particularly over history issues, youth exchange, textbooks, cultural events, bringing war veterans together. That is happening, but to do that more, war veterans from different sides. The third thing is to focus on domestic reform. so that there's more hope among the publics of these countries. And finally, and this is the one where we have absolutely no control, we have to encounter a less chaotic, less fragile international system that only adds to the problems of the region and takes away people's attention from the region. I think that's a very highly unlikely development, that the world will become less fragile, less chaotic, and less hopeful. So I'm sorry to end on that note, but but that's where I'd like to finish. So thank you.